My name is Charles Geddes. I'm a research scientist in weed ecology and cropping systems. I work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada just down the road here. And so our research, in general, it focuses a lot on herbicide resistance, right? So some of these handouts here, there's one of the handouts, it looks like this, is just some information on the types of research that we lead. And I thank the Alberta Wheat Commission for helping us put these nice, pretty handouts together. But this, yeah, if you can hold this, Vanna, please.
While I'm here, everybody, sorry to interrupt you. This is a request from Morton. Can I get the whole group to kind of come this way, just because of the wind and the microphones? Please don't mess up our production value.
There you go. Okay, so
face this way more, Charles. Like, stand where Ken is.
Stay here. You stay here, Charles.
Yeah, that's a little better.
Okay, so
Still
Ken
windy.
is holding up a nice, pretty handout, and this handout just outlines some of the research projects that the AAFC weed scientists in Alberta are leading. Just for your information, the types of research that we work on at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So in Alberta, there's 2 weed scientists with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. There's myself based out of Lethbridge, and then there's Brianne Tideman based out of Lacombe. And again, that's just the type of research that we work on. But in general, it centers around integrated weed management. So in the other handout here that looks like this is also just some very general information on herbicide resistance and integrated weed management. So the idea here, when I was here last year, I can't remember if it was the plot hop or the field school, we talked about kochia, and we talked a lot about herbicide options for kochia. So this year we wanted to do something a little different. We can talk about herbicides for sure, but I also wanted to talk about cultural weed management. Okay, and so cultural weed management is essentially using agronomy type of tools to help increase the ability for a crop to compete with weeds, right? And this is really comes into play when we're talking about mitigating and managing herbicide resistance, right? One of the main points that'll sort of come from this talk is that when we talk about managing herbicide resistance, there's a lot of adoption of what we call integrated herbicide strategies, which is not integrated weed management, right? So that is the chemical part of integrated weed management. And if you look at this nice, pretty figure, there's actually 4 components to integrated weed management. There's chemical, which is herbicides and different herbicide options, layering herbicides, rotating, mixing herbicides. So that's one component, but then there's physical weed management, which is disrupting the weed's life cycle in some way. So if you think about things like mowing or tilling, or I would even consider harvest weed seed control a form of physical management, such as crushing the seeds at harvest. There's also cultural weed management, which I mentioned, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So behind me we have just a demo here. I specifically stood on the side that doesn't have the signs because we're going to play a little game here. Okay, so first of all, I would like you just to kind of walk up and down. The plots are going this direction, and just stand by the area that you think has the most weeds first of all, and then we'll talk about the one that has the least. So the worst weed management, just, you think that's the one? Yeah, so Ken's got it here. This is
You could join me if you want.
It actually worked out. This is what we expected to be the worst weed management based on our treatments, okay? The treatments that we're looking at here it's a 3-way, what we call a 3-way factorial, right? So there's first of all, it's all looking at wheat, but the first factor is whether they applied a residual pre-herbicide, and so we compared on one part, we're looking at just at AIM or carfentrazone as a product that doesn't necessarily have residual control, right? And then comparing that with something like fierce, so flumioxazin and pyroxasulfone, which should have a certain level of residual control. Okay. The second factor was looking at the row spacing of wheat and comparing a narrow row spacing versus a wide row spacing. And do we know what the row spacings ended up being? Does anyone know? 9 and 12. So you should be able to pick those out. So 9 versus 12, it almost looks to me like it might be a little bit wider than 12 for the wide row spacing. And then the third factor is the seeding rate of wheat. And so all combinations of the with versus without a residual pre-emergence herbicide, narrow versus wide row spacing, and then 200 seeds per meter squared versus 400 seeds per meter squared seeding rate are present here. So the next one, which I think is maybe a bit more challenging, is can you spot which of the plots has the most effective weed management? Feel free to just walk up and down here. Let's go for a walk. It's not that one.
Yeah, it does look like 50.
Here.
I'm thinking right around here.
Yeah, like how wide are they?
Dark count.
Dark count. Like how many rows is it?
I would say the width is probably, what would you think? The plot? 4 meters? Yeah, 4 meters, roughly.
I'm gonna say here.
Okay,
Just to
My
be
guess.
different. Right here.
that's the one.
Put our bet.
Yeah, pretty good.
The broadleaf at the back.
I know, but that's in the back.
Okay.
Farmer doesn't notice that stuff right in the back. So.
Is there a consensus?
No.
No, never, right? So now, okay, I'll stand here. Ken, can you stand over there, roughly? And then you guys just walk around to the other side of the plot. They're all labeled. Yeah, you can.
No, I wouldn't want to.
It's a demo for today, so.
There's 9.5 and 14.
Okay, the row spacing was 9.5 and 14 inches, just for your information.
Dr. Geddes, you're great on wild oats, but what's this funny stuff in here? You didn't take care of that.
Okay. All right, so can someone tell me what this plot is here? What does it say on the sign there?
It says fierce, glyphosate, wide row spacing, 400 seeds per square meter.
Okay, so the wide row spacing at 400 seeds per meter squared with the residual pre-emergence product. And then the other plot I think was down here, right? Do we know which one it was here? This one? Okay, what does this one say?
This one is aim, glyphosate, narrow, and 400 seeds.
Yes.
Okay, right. So that is absent of the pre-emergence residual, but with the optimal cultural management, where we have narrow row spacing and higher seeding rates.
Does that mean George was wrong?
You haven't taken the yield yet, Ken.
That's right. Okay, I'm just gonna walk through here.
That one yields more silage. Don't quote that one.
That's the only choice you got. Silage it.
Okay, so based on what I expected from this demo, I would have actually expected the plot at the far end to be the best. So come down here and take a look.
Don't trip it. Yeah, don't worry, George.
The weed pressure was higher here.
It could be the weed pressure, right? Weeds are inherently patchy.
Yeah, that should be.
So this plot here is the pre-emergence residual, narrow row spacing, higher seeding rate. So we would have expected that one to have the best weed control out of the options that are available here, and then on the far end would be the worst. Yes.
So you did no in-season graminicide nor broadleaf?
That's yeah, so I think they may have actually applied something to the other half of the plots, and I remember talking to Mike about that, I think, but I don't know what the product is. We talked about splitting the plots down the center, so this part of the plots here would have not had anything applied.
But that side, okay, that explains
As soon as you get halfway through, you start seeing no more kochia, right? Okay, so this was just kind of a quick demonstration, and so I think what I got out of it, one of the plots had the wide row spacing, which I didn't expect. The other one that we thought had better weed control had what we would consider the optimal cultural weed management, narrow row spacing, higher seeding rates. So we, just down the road here, over the last 5 years, we've had we had a project that was looking at managing glyphosate-resistant kochia, and so this was a 5-year project. We conducted multiple different experiments looking at kochia management, and so one of those was looking at a spring wheat, canola, spring wheat, lentil crop rotation, and so it's a fully phased experiment. So what we mean by that is every crop or every part of that rotation was present every year, so it has another form of internal replication. But we also had that entire rotation present with comparing wide versus narrow row spacing. In our experiment, the rows were quite wide. They were 18 inches versus 9 inches for the narrow. And then for the seeding rates, we had the same seeding rates as here. For wheat, it was 200 versus 400 seeds per meter squared. But for all of those crops, it was what we would consider on, say, the lower end of recommended versus double that. And so what we found was that the rotations that had cultural weed management, or the optimal cultural weed management with the narrow row spacing, and the higher seeding rates had far better management of the kochia. Throughout the entire experiment, we were practicing what we would have considered to be good layering of multiple effective modes of action applied in any given year. So we were trying to use basically what a farmer would be doing, or perhaps should be doing, with herbicide layering, multiple effective modes of action. That wasn't enough to control the kochia in that particular experiment because it's just infested. It's a mat of kochia outside of those plots. So we've just finished that particular study off, and after 4 years, so averaged over all of the crops in the rotation, over all of the years of the study, we found that narrowing up row spacing reduced kochia densities by 39%. It reduced kochia biomass by 55% compared with the wide row spacing. And at the end of the study, it reduced the kochia seed bank by 34%. Okay.
Sorry, Charles, that was 9 and 12?
That was 9 versus 18.
9
so
versus 18.
18 being quite wide, right?
So what size opener? Because they found a better effect if there was a 3.5 or opener or 3/4 inch opener.
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure exactly what it would have been for the opener. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a good answer for you for that one.
So a question then, maybe I'm getting headed here, but
Yep.
if I only could have a choice of either doing wide rows or narrow rows, or else going high seeding rate, which is going to give me the better response?
Okay, well, thank you for asking that, because that's where I'm going. So the other factor in that experiment, again, was the recommended versus double the recommended seeding rates in all of the crops throughout the rotations, right? So I mentioned row spacing earlier. So for seeding rate, we saw throughout the entire study, the higher seeding rate had 32% reduction in kochia density, 51% reduction in kochia biomass, and reduced the seed bank by 44%, comparing just recommended versus double the recommended seeding rates. So still a pretty substantial effect just from increasing that seeding rate. But the real beauty was when you mix the two together, right? So it's one thing to increase your seeding rate, but if you're using wide rows, you're just packing it more into those wide rows, right? It's not using the entire seed bed to its full potential when it comes to establishing your crop, right? So when we mix the two together, so comparing narrow row spacing and double the recommended seeding rates versus the wide row spacing at recommended seeding rates, we found that we reduced kochia density by 64% overall. We reduced kochia biomass by 80% overall, and we reduced the seed bank at the end of the study by 63%. So, to put that into perspective now, I mentioned an 80% reduction in kochia biomass, right? Just by decreasing row spacings, increasing seeding rates. To put that into perspective, that 80% is essentially the threshold based on herbicide regulators, it's the threshold required to label a herbicide with control of a specific weed species, right? So just by combining these two cultural weed management practices, we achieved what could be the same efficacy as a new effective herbicide mode of action. So the whole point there is that, especially when it comes to kochia, having a competitive crop goes a long way, right? So if you have a competitive crop, that's at least half the battle, right? So some of our other work there, we looked at crop rotations as well. So the experiment, again, it was looking at crop rotation diversity, and so the diversity of crops in the rotation, but then also the diversity of the life cycles of the crops in the rotation. And so what I mean by that is we had a whole range of rotations that were all summer annual crops, and then we had those same rotations, and it had spring wheat in every second year. We pulled out the spring wheat and replaced it with winter wheat. So we're alternating a summer annual, winter annual crop rotation. And we found that that was also a very beneficial tool when it came to managing kochia. So results at the end of that study, we found that comparing rotations that had winter wheat compared to the same rotations that had spring wheat instead, we found that the winter wheat rotations reduced kochia densities by 60% overall. This is averaged across all of the years, so the years that had winter wheat, but also the years that didn't. It reduced kochia biomass by 72% overall, and it reduced the seed bank in half by the end of the study, so it was 51% reduction in the seed bank. So winter wheat can be a tool to use to help manage herbicide-resistant kochia, right?
So without changing it to crop rotation, a lot of guys like to put peas in first and kind of thing, like maybe we just switch it out to wheat first, earlier.
Yeah, well, so the idea here, I mean, obviously crop rotation is still important, right? But the act of replacing a summer annual crop in the rotation with a winter annual went a long way. And so the reasons for that, right, is kochia is a summer annual weed, right? So winter wheat seeded in the fall, it's already established in the spring when kochia is just trying to emerge. So your crop is much more competitive with kochia, or the kochia that escaped the herbicide application, right? But the other factor is that we've also found that kochia really doesn't start to produce seed until roughly mid-August, right? So this year, I bet winter wheat is going to be off before then, right? So so the idea there is that you're harvesting your winter wheat. At the same time, if there is kochia present, you're also decapitating those kochia plants and helping to limit some of that seed production on those kochia plants, and you have less seed going back into the soil seed bank.
Charles, is that a growing degree day or a photo period thing? Like, would the kochia be further along now, do you think?
It's, yeah, so that's a good question. Whether it's growing degree days or photo period that drives seed production for kochia, and the real answer is I need to look at the data more to figure it out. But so talking about kochia seed production in mid-August, this is averaged across 14 site years across Western Canada. So here in southern Alberta, but we also in Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. So it's quite likely a combination of a few things, right? But it tended to be, based on calendar dates, roughly mid-August. Was when kochia started to produce seed, and then it ramps up very quickly over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then levels off after that. And so that's partially partially explains why winter wheat is a good tool to help with kochia management. The other factor we looked at in that crop rotation study was just taking the summer annual rotation completely out and replacing it with a perennial, which was alfalfa and meadow brome mixture, harvested for hay roughly 2 times a year. And the idea there being that we're trying to prevent the kochia from going to seed, cutting it off a couple times a year and using it as a forage, right? And so what we found, I think it was sort of what we expected. When you're the establishment year for the alfalfa, it took a while to get it going, right? Which is to be expected. The first year we seeded the alfalfa meadow brome in the spring. The plots just looked like a kochia plot, really. We had kochia up to, I would say, about there. So what we did was we just came in and cut that kochia off like we would be using it as a feed, right? And removed that kochia from those plots. And the next year, it was an excellent stand of alfalfa meadow brome. So we did get some fairly good establishment from those treatments. And in years, especially in years 3 and 4 of that study, it was very difficult to find any kochia plants in the perennial. So we would have expected that to be the best thing from that rotation study. And visually it was by the end of the 4th year. But when we looked at the seed bank after that entire study, so in the fall of the 4th year, we actually found that the kochia seed was still there in the seed bank that would have came from the start of the study 4 years earlier, which was quite surprising.
Yeah.
I didn't expect that to actually happen.
How long is it viable?
So kochia seed, what research has shown is that kochia seed typically stays viable for about 1 to 2 years. So that would be time to a 90% decline in the seed bank. So based on that, we would have expected there to be essentially no kochia there, right? But we actually found that the perennial plot had slightly higher seed bank than even the summer annual rotations. So what that tells me is that when weed seeds are in the seed bank, there's a few different avenues for them to expire, right? But generally, it is related to some form of a microbial decay, right? And so what I expect happened, and we haven't tested this, but what I expect happened was that there was less seed to soil contact in that perennial treatment, right? Where we had seeds that were sort of caught up in a thatch layer and not being able to contact the soil properly. We didn't see the same level of microbial decay of the kochia seed. That's what I expect happened, but we still need to look at that. Anyway, something that was contrary to what I thought when I initially established that
No, but
experiment.
also, part of it is I thought was in that first half inch, the soil temperature, it kind of starts it off.
Yep.
Versus where you had a cover crop or something in there that kept that soil temperature from going that good. And then, but any area that you have that's got a little more bare soil and the soil gets a heat like we did this year, kochia just seems to go crazy. So
Yep.
I don't know if that's something you guys looked at or not.
That could be one reason to explain it anyway. We haven't looked at that, so we just analyzed these data over the winter, so it's still kind of new results, but definitely something to look at. Yeah, temperature certainly could play a role. The other thing is that under the perennial, I expect there to be less moisture there as well. So it wasn't an irrigated experiment, right? So it could be less moisture, less microbial decay as a result, right? Anyway, I thought it was quite interesting.
In the rotation trial, was there optimal other herbicide use then in the rotation as well? Or it wasn't like a no herbicide, it was...
No, it was, we were layering herbicides where we could, right? It was a bit more complicated because depending on recropping restrictions, some of the products that we could use, we couldn't use in other parts of the rotation, right? Whereas the first study on row spacing and seeding rates, it was the same herbicides throughout everything, right? So, yeah. Any questions on that?
Slightly different, but still kochia related. What do you think the opportunities are to look at management strategies that prevent windblown kochia in there? Because I think like we can do our best that we can managing it, and then it blows in from the neighbor or anything like that. Should we be looking at like field type boundary type approaches, or?
It's that's a really good point, right? So kochia being a tumbleweed, it can spread its seed fairly quickly, right? Research that took place here in Lethbridge, also in Saskatoon, showed that tumbleweeds blowing, they lose about 90% of their seed within the first kilometer. But then the question is, how much of that extra 10%, how far does that actually go, right? 10% of 20,000 seeds is still quite a bit, right? So the question was centered around what can you do to help prevent that tumbling, right? And so much of that research, I would say, hasn't been done. But what we could expect is that, first of all, taller stubble should help prevent some of the tumbling, right? But probably more appropriate are things like field boundaries, right? So whether it's a tree line or we always see on fence lines, right? You'll see a fence line full of kochia plants, right? So those fence lines do help in some of that sort of biosecurity, you could say, right? But with many of the fields, those fence lines have been removed. So it could have really helped, I think, when preventing some of that kochia tumbling. So now that we talked about some of the cultural management, I wanted to cover that first. I'll talk a little bit about herbicide resistance in kochia and where we're at. So some of the research that I have the pleasure of leading, it's called the Prairie Herbicide Resistant Weed Surveys. And we, aside from that, we also look at a separate survey for herbicide resistance in kochia specifically. The reason why they're separate is because the prairie herbicide resistant weed surveys are done before harvest. Those are the ones that give you all of the results on wild oat, for example, but a whole range of other species. Kochia, it's actually better to collect the seed after harvest, so we do that one in October. And so we just collect seed from lateral branches below the cutter bar height, and there's lots of seed there to do our resistance testing. So the last survey in Alberta took place in October of 2021, and what we found was that, first of all, Group 2 resistance, we don't even bother testing for it anymore because the last how many rounds of surveys over the last decade have all shown 100% of the populations have some level of Group 2 resistance. So it's safe to assume if you're dealing with kochia, it has Group 2 resistance. Okay. From there, glyphosate resistance, we found 78% of the populations that we collected and tested, and this was about just over 300 populations in the province. 78% of them had some level of glyphosate resistance. And so when I'm talking about resistance, that is 78% of those populations had that trait present in them. But it ranges everywhere from, say, 1% all the way up to 100% of the individuals in that population being glyphosate resistant, right? So when we see resistance spreading, we'll see it spreading from one field to another, but we'll also see it growing within populations where you see more and more of the individuals in that population taking on the trait, right? So there's a whole range, as I mentioned, anywhere from 1% to 100% of those individuals being glyphosate resistant, but the trait was present in 78% of the population.
When was that one done?
2021.
Yeah, I think I could assume it's 100 now.
So it's quite possibly 100 or close.
But your method of surveying makes it somewhat self-fulfilling, doesn't it? Because if you're only surveying fields after harvest that have kochia, you haven't surveyed the fields that had kochia but it got controlled in the spring.
That's correct.
So,
Yep.
those
So these are
a little bit, could be a little bit.
Yep, yeah. So these are the survey takes place after harvest. So these are kochia plants that are uncontrolled to begin with, right? I should mention that the survey, it covers farm fields, but it also covers what we call ruderal areas, or areas that are not under agricultural production. So things like ditches, right? Roadsides, oil well leases, all of this, right? So it's the survey does cover areas that maybe didn't see those herbicide applications in the first place, but you're right.
Grab some from the rail line neighbor.
Yeah, it's.
All covered in kochia.
Oh yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, it's not difficult to find a kochia population around here.
Charles, how far north did that survey go?
The survey, It went, I'm trying to think now. It was, I would say 20, 30 minutes north of Calgary. It was like the northern boundary of the survey. But kochia is moving its way further and further north. We're seeing lots of reports of kochia being found further north in areas where it hasn't been found previously.
Yes, so there's on Twitter there's a bunch of threads on kochia being really bad around Lloydminster.
Yeah.
So would you expect that there'd be the same kind of resistant populations there as down here?
I do, so it kind of depends on where exactly you're talking about. Lloydminster area, it could very well be similar. We have sampled kochia as far north as the Peace River region as well, where I think it was 2021, we had a really warm year, right? And kochia was thriving up there as well. We wanted to see if it could produce seed that far north, and we found that some of those plants had between 20 and 50,000 seeds on them. So it definitely can produce seed that far north. We also tested them for resistance and found that they were group 2 resistant, but they were susceptible to glyphosate and the synthetic auxins. Okay. So the next thing we looked at was dicamba resistance for the kochia, so synthetic auxin group 4 herbicide, primarily used in small grain cereals. And so we found that 28% of those populations had some level of dicamba resistance, but almost all of them were what I would consider low-level resistance, which means that it was between 1 and 20% of the individuals in the population had that trait at the time, right? So these are things that can quite easily be missed because herbicides are rarely 100% effective, right? So it could easily be missed as just not complete control with your herbicide at this point, but as those plants cross, it will continue to grow within those populations. We saw the same thing with glyphosate resistance at the start as well. We also looked at fluroxypyr resistance, which is another synthetic auxin active ingredient, but from a slightly different chemical family within group 4. And so we found that 44% of the populations that we tested from Alberta had fluroxypyr resistance. It was similar in the fact that the majority of them had low-level resistance, so 1 to 20% of the individuals, but a few more had moderate resistance, which would be 20 to 60% as well. And I think maybe only one had high-level resistance, about 60%. So that was kind of the status of herbicide resistance in kochia. Something interesting that came out of that survey, and it also corresponded with when we reanalyzed some results from previous surveys of Alberta as well. We found that fluroxypyr resistance and dicamba resistance don't necessarily overlap, right? I mentioned 44% for fluroxypyr, 28% for dicamba, but it was actually a very small number. I think it was 14% overlapped and had both, right? But it was more likely that you would have resistance to one and not the other than it was to have both. So that was something interesting that came from that survey. And so some of our research is moving forward will be to try and figure out why exactly, right? Because what that tells me is it's something related to the mechanism of synthetic auxin resistance in kochia. And that's still a relatively new and undiscovered area of research, right? So we know some of the mechanisms, but we know that there's also more that we don't know at this point. So the new thing is group 14 resistance in kochia. So last year, I guess it was a year ago, I made a prediction that group 14 resistance was not too far away, based on simply based on herbicide use patterns, right? So we're talking about the majority of populations having glyphosate resistance. Many farmers are adding in group 14s to their pre-seed or pre-emergence herbicides to help get an edge on that glyphosate-resistant kochia. Unfortunately, what that does is it basically takes the selection pressure from glyphosate and puts it on the group 14 now, right? So we were seeing fairly wide selection pressure for group 14 resistance, which is why a year ago I thought it was sort of the next thing around the corner for kochia, and it just so happens that was the case. We did find in a grower submitted sample from Saskatchewan, we found group 14 resistance, and so we've been doing a lot of research on that, trying to figure out cross resistance to group 14 products, because there's a whole range of group 14s at our disposal. Maybe that's not the right way to say it, I don't know. But yeah, so there's a whole range of group 14 products. So some of the ones that we've tested so far, we've tested saflufenicil, we tested carfentrazone, foliar applied, we tested sulfentrazone or authority soil applied, so the residual aspect of it. We also tested tiafenicil, a new one that would essentially just on the market this year. We tested pyroflufen, we tested aciflorifin, which is one that we don't use as much out here, more of a soybean herbicide in Manitoba, as well as flumioxazin. And so far we've found that this particular population has been resistant to all of those except for the aciflorifin. And so aciflorifin, compared with these others, is a bit unique because it's a different chemical family of group 14s. Primarily this chemical family is used as a bean herbicide, right? So these are products that we don't really use to a great extent out here. But we did find that there was resistance to all of those group 14 active ingredients except for aciflorifin, and we're still continuing down the line as far as other group 14 active ingredients and whether there is resistance to those as well. Any questions on that so far? It's unfortunate news. No questions. Okay, so group 14 resistance is of course going to have a fairly large impact if it spreads, right? And what we've, based on the history of resistance in kochia, it will be about a decade before we see it being fairly widespread. The unfortunate, the first thing that comes to mind is, can't you just quarantine that field, make sure there's no kochia that goes to seed, right? Unfortunately, at the same time that we discovered this, or shortly after we discovered this, our colleagues from North Dakota also found group 14 resistant kochia there in multiple different fields. So it is something that's more widespread than a single population. The good news is that we went back and screened all of our populations that we collected between 2018 and 2021. So about 900 populations from across the prairies, and didn't find a thing in those. So it's only known to occur in one field in Western Canada so far. But it's something that is quite likely to come down the road. Okay? So then the question becomes, well, if group 14s don't work, now what do you do, right? Especially for that pre-seed window, right? And so when it comes to herbicides, our options start to get limited fairly quickly, especially when we're seeing broad level cross resistance to essentially all of the group 14s that we've tested so far, except for that one aciflorifin product. So pre-seed herbicides will be very limited if this does spread beyond these initial fields anyway. And so the unfortunate fact is that it will potentially cause reversion to more tillage to manage weeds pre-seed, which comes with a whole other layer of potential issues related to soil health, right? So our research moving forward will hopefully be focusing on what do you do to manage kochia during that pre-seed window as well, right? So tillage being one of those options. There's other herbicide, more broad spectrum herbicide products that are available, but they're not necessarily used in that pre-seed window, right? So there could potentially be some options there, but we are seeing the toolbox, especially when it comes to herbicides, being more limited than what we have been dealing with in the past. Right?
Has there been any evidence of glufosinate resistance?
So that's a good question. I get that question a lot, and we have tested populations with suspected glufosinate resistance, but to date they've all came back susceptible. So the good news is that we haven't found it yet. It doesn't mean that it doesn't occur, but based on all of the testing we've done, we haven't found it. And the same with bromoxynil as well, right? Which is another important one when it comes to kochia.
I don't know that you mentioned the 2,4-D resistance. I'm guessing it's pretty high now too.
Yeah, so 2,4-D. So in fact, we don't even test for 2,4-D really. I mean, I've done some in the past, but it doesn't really control kochia that great in the first place. So it makes it really difficult to tell, is it resistance or is it just lack of control from that particular active ingredient, right? So it doesn't have the same level of activity on kochia as some of these other synthetic auxins. So we don't really know if that is related to something related to resistance, or is that just natural tolerance in kochia in the first place?
A separate question, we seem to be investing tons of money into the genomics side of things. Is there any molecular opportunities to deal with weeds in a slightly different way?
Potentially. So as far as genomics or molecular based opportunities, one of the things that we've started to work on is RNAi for kochia management. So we essentially, what we're hoping to do with it, and we have this in as a proposal right now actually, is we've designed 2 double-stranded RNA constructs that should have activity on EPSPS, or the enzyme EPSPS, which is the target site for glyphosate, right? And so the idea behind it being the mechanism of glyphosate resistance in kochia is what we call EPSPS gene duplication. So your herbicide comes in, binds to EPSPS, the enzyme site, right? But now glyphosate resistant kochia just has multiple copies of it, right? So when we first found glyphosate resistance on the prairies, it was about 3 to 6 times the number of EPSPS copies. Now it's anywhere from 3 to about 40. So it has been increasing over time as these plants have been crossing, right? But the idea here is that our double-stranded RNA should be able to silence some of those extra copies of EPSPS and temporarily revert glyphosate-resistant kochia back to glyphosate-susceptible kochia. So some of our initial testing has essentially been applying the double-stranded RNA and then about 48 hours later applying glyphosate to try and sort of regain some of that efficacy. It's all very early, so I mean that's not a silver bullet, I would say, coming down the pipeline anytime soon. But it is something that in theory should work, we'll say that.
Just need a little hope.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
What about group 27?
Yeah, so group 27 is another important one when it comes to kochia, right? So pyrosolvitol especially being one that we, I think that a lot of farmers are relying on for their kochia management. And so we haven't found any group 27 resistance to date. Again, kind of like the glufosinate, that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't occur, it just means that we haven't found it. Okay. We're also seeing with the group 27s other products coming on the market, right, with that are used in different windows than pyrosolvitol, right? So pyrosolvitol being generally, well, mixed with bromoxynil, being used post-emergence, right? But we're also seeing pre-seed products for canola, for example, like Certitude, that is a similar in the fact that it's the same 2 modes of action, a group 6, a group 27, except in that case the 27 doesn't have that much residual control or residual activity compared with pyrosolvitol. But the idea here being we're seeing these similar mixtures sort of coming on the market, and what does that actually do to selection pressure for that type of resistance? And the answer is unknown at this point, but potentially contributes to it.
Do you think there's any merit in the soil inversion techniques that some people are talking about, particularly for wild oats, like just basically flip the soil over and bury it too deep that it can't?
Yeah, bring out the plow again. Is that
Well,
what you're saying?
it's not a plow. They're trying to develop more soil conservation based approaches of basically flipping it over.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Like, it potentially has its merits, right? I mentioned seed to soil contact being important for decay of weed seeds in the soil seed bank, right? So it could potentially help with that, get that seed to soil contact, especially in our sort of no-till systems. You do get a bit of a thatch layer, and some of those seeds don't always make it down into the soil, right? Wild oat is pretty efficient because it has a hygroscopic arm that helps it drill itself into soil cracks, right? But other species don't have that, right? So it could potentially help with that. On the flip side, though, it could also not help with it, because we've found with various weed species, often the deeper they are buried in the soil, the more dormancy they have, right? So when you come to you can flip it over and bury those weed seeds at a depth at which they don't emerge, but it does to a certain degree help promote those seeds going into dormancy, which helps with persistence, right? So when you go to retill that soil, you could be bringing them back up to the soil surface again. So that wasn't a yes or a no, because the answer isn't straightforward. All right. So some of the things, I mean, I talked a lot on kochia because it's my favorite weed, and we do a lot of research on kochia, being located in Lethbridge here. But in this particular trial behind us, I would say one of the biggest problems is wild oat. And so Ken or anyone else on the Farming Smarter team, do you know what was sprayed in here for post-emergence? I know, yeah, Mike and I kind of just mentioned it in passing. So.
Likely the axial.
Yeah, so it's quite possible. When it comes to wild oat, I would consider that also one of the worst weeds that we have across Western Canada, potentially even having a larger impact than kochia, because it has a very large impact in areas where kochia doesn't occur as well, right? It's well adapted to essentially all areas of agricultural production in Western Canada. Based on our surveys, so this year actually is the Alberta Weed Survey. So my colleague from Saskatoon, Julia Leeson, her position is the weed monitoring biologist, and she coordinates what we call the weed abundance surveys. And so this covers about 4,000 fields across the prairies every 4 years. This year is Alberta's turn, so the survey will cover about 1,200 fields across Alberta. And so we come in on a portion of those and do the herbicide resistance survey as well. And our most common weed that we're collecting is wild oat in that survey, right? So based on the last survey that took place in Alberta, which was 2017, that survey showed that well over half of the wild oat populations collected had group 1 resistance. And then in addition to that, it was, so that was 58% of the fields where wild oat was collected and tested in that survey, and 41% of all of the fields included in the survey in Alberta. Group 2 resistance was 40% of the fields where wild oat was collected and tested, and the mixture of group 1 and 2 resistance was in 29% of those fields. So over a quarter of the fields where we're collecting wild oat pre-harvest have group 1 and 2 resistance in Alberta, which is, I was actually quite surprised by that. But what we're seeing in the current round of surveys, so we did Saskatchewan in 2019-2020, we did Manitoba last year, and then Alberta this year, or we will be doing Alberta this year. We're finding that wild oat, group 1 resistance in wild oat is in the 70s as far as percentage, at least from the Saskatchewan survey where we've completed all of that sample screening. So when you get resistance to group 1 and 2 products, that drastically limits your options as far as wild oat control in the majority of field crops that we grow, right? So things like wheat, barley, your various pulses, right? In fact, one of the main crops that still has post-emergence herbicide options is your herbicide-tolerant canola, right? So either glyphosate-resistant canola or glufosinate-resistant canola. So keeping that canola in the rotation can actually help with this issue quite a bit. And I think that is actually one of the things that's been limiting further spread of group 1 and 2 resistance in wild oat. If we didn't have that, we would probably be spreading even faster. So when we talk about wild oat, though, I'm just going to check, how much time do I have?
Till 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock, okay. 3 more hours. All right. So when we talk about herbicide resistance in wild oat, I'm mentioning group 1 herbicides, group 2 herbicides, but in reality it's not that simple, right? A lot of herbicide resistance has been communicated based on the mode of action, and in some cases it is that simple, but in many of them it's not, right? As I mentioned with the group 14s and kochia, you can see variable cross resistance even within a mode of action where some of the active ingredients remain effective and others are not, right? And we see the same thing quite commonly with group 1 resistance in wild oat. So there's multiple mechanisms that can confer herbicide resistance in wild oat, and it depends on the specific mechanism what spectrum of resistance you actually have, especially with the group 1s, where you can have resistance to the FOPs but not the DIMs, or the FOPs and the DIMs but not the DENs, right? FOPs, DIMs, and DENs being different chemical families within the group 1 mode of action, right? So they mentioned axial being the only DEN that's available. So the idea there is that you can have resistance to all of those, but we see it quite commonly where you have resistance to a certain chemical family but not the others, and it depends on the depends on the mechanism of resistance within that specific population. Wild oat is different from kochia in the fact that it doesn't cross-pollinate to the same degree, right? So kochia is very effective at outcrossing, so we're seeing resistance traits spreading through pollen as well as through the seed, whereas wild oat is more of a selfing species. It does have a certain level of cross-pollination, but it's rather limited when you compare it with kochia. So when we're seeing resistance spreading, it's usually more often due to the physical spread of wild oat seeds from one field to another, or selection for that resistance in situ or in that specific field. So it can be more variable from field to field than kochia when it comes to resistance, and that's why resistance testing is essential when it comes to herbicide resistance in wild oat, because resistance testing from a diagnostic lab can tell you if you have resistance to one of those chemical families but not the other, right? So it's another tool that can help tell you what still is effective when it comes to post-emergence herbicides for wild oat. And I mean the same with a whole range of other species as well. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Does the wild oat seed survive the rumen of a cow?
Yeah, good question. So does wild oat seed survive the rumen of a cow? I'm not 100% sure on the answer. I want to say maybe not, but I know the paper to look at.
The next question is, can I haul it around? You know, feedlot cattle get fed a lot of screenings, which are your resistant weeds.
Yeah.
So did I import group 1 resistant wild oats by my manure spreading?
It's possible. Yeah. So I'd have to double check on the survival, the rumen survival of wild oat seed. I know for kochia it does survive. Studies that were done here in Lethbridge showed that kochia seed, about 10 to 15% of the seed survived both in siling and rumen digestion. So if you are spreading manure that came from kochia that had seed on it, right, then you're potentially also spreading kochia and the wonderful resistance traits that come along with that.
No pigweed survives.
Yeah, so it depends on the species. So some weed species do survive rumen digestion and composting, others don't. With kochia, if you compost that manure, the research at least has shown that it should be effective in devitalizing those seeds. Okay. Any other questions?
Awesome. You got no shortage of things to finish your career off with,
Yeah,
even though
there's
you
lots
just
to
started,
look
right?
at, right? So,
Join me in thanking Dr. Charles Geddes.
thank you very much.